The world of wrestling has seen a long history of masked performers pass through its doors over the years. That said, with this also comes the tradition of unmasking, something which, while it doesn't happen very often, is always exciting when it does. But what are the most memorable examples of this? Well, that's exactly what we're going to be looking at today. So join us as we take a deep dive into Secret Identities Revealed, wrestling's biggest unmaskings. Of course, with a topic like this, there's only one place we can start because, as probably the most famous luchador of the 21st century, when Rey Mysterio was asked to take his mask off in late 90s WCW, it certainly started a conversation amongst fans. But then, how couldn't it? After all, prior to that, Mysterio had helped to introduce American audiences to the style with his high-flying efforts in World Championship Wrestling's Cruiserweight division. And because of that, he gained worldwide fame and accolades for his efforts, enough to where by the time the late 90s rolled around, he was already considered among the greatest Mexican stars of all time, right up there alongside the likes of El Santo and Blue Demon. On top of this, with him being a hit with younger fans, it meant he was a potential merchandising cash cow. So that's what made it all the more confusing when, in February of 1999, Eric Bischoff booked Rey to lose his mask after he and Conan failed to defeat Scott Hall and Kevin Nash in a tag match. Yes, rather than make a small fortune selling replica masks and allowing Mysterio to continue on doing what he did best, Eazy-E seemed to be under the belief that no one with their face hidden could get over with fans. But this ignored the fact that the former Cruiserweight champion was already over with fans, of course, just as it ignored the fact that part of the reason he was so over was because, like with Spider-Man, his hidden identity meant that any kid could look at him and put themselves in his place with ease. Once he lost this aspect of his character, though, and it became clear that he was just Oscar Gutierrez, the mystique was all but gone. So now missing this key element, Rey's popularity began to slide, never to the point he was a jobber, but definitely enough to where he never felt as strong as he had before. That's why it was lucky then that when WCW went under and Rey signed with WWE in 2002, he was able to put the mask back on and regain this aura. Sure, he had to go to the Lucha Council in order to get permission to do this, but once their blessing was given, it was all go for him in New York. And that meant despite being a smaller guy, he'd eventually shatter through the glass ceiling to become a 3-time world champion, 1-time Royal Rumble winner, and 3-time Wrestling Hall of Famer. Would this have happened if he still had his face exposed? Maybe, but it certainly wouldn't have had the same magic to it if he did, because there's something about a superhero with a secret identity which can't help but capture people's attention. But while Rey was eventually able to get his mask back, other contemporaries of his from WCW weren't so lucky. That's right, apparently Eric Bischoff had a vendetta against all luchadors during the late 90s, and if you need any further evidence of this, you only have to look at what happened to Juventud Guerrera in 1998. Of course, Juvi was never as big of a star as Rey, and he wasn't quite as good of a wrestler either. But that didn't mean he didn't have a lot of potential as a mid-card act, one who could inspire children everywhere with his high-flying theatrics. Unfortunately for him, though, while he would ultimately maintain a role like this on the card, he'd have to do so without his mask. And that was because, after spending his early days in Atlanta hiding his visage, just as he had done in AAA and ECW, it was decided that he'd put this up for grabs during a hair versus mask match with Chris Jericho at that February's Super Brawl 8. From there then, after a battle which waged on for 13.5 minutes, Jericho ended up coming out on top. And as a result of this, Guerrero was forced to expose his face to the world for the first time, with him revealing here that he actually had a pretty decent look for a wrestler. Yes, with his long hair and handsome face, Juvi ended up being something of a hit with certain female fans. Not that this stopped Y2J from mocking him after the fact though, and repeatedly referring to him as Quasi-Juice, a play on Quasimodo from the Hunchback of Notre Dame. Still, even if he was being made fun of by the heel, Guerrero maintained a certain popularity as a babyface going forward regardless, enough to where he'd become Cruiserweight champion on 2 more occasions. The problem, however, lies with what happened a few years later as, when WCW went out of business and Vince McMahon started bringing people over to his company instead, the Mexico City native just didn't stand out enough without his mask, and so because of this, he became little more than a jobber in WWE as part of the infamous Mexicools. But at least Juvi only had to lose his face covering once, the same of which can't be said for his Mexicools stablemate Psychosis. No, in this case, while working with WCW in 1999, he'd get unmasked on 2 separate occasions. How did this happen? Well, after spending the early part of his career also working for AAA and ECW, Psychosis made the jump to Atlanta in 1996 and there quickly became a member of the Latino World Order. Once that came to an end, however, it was determined that the Tijuana native needed something new in order to revitalize his character. But again, not seeming to understand the merchandising potential in selling a bunch of replica masks to children, Eric Bischoff decided the best way to do this was to remove Psychosis' trademark face covering. And that's what led to a bout between him and Rey Mysterio at a house show on August 6th of 1999 then, where in front of his hometown audience, the former LWO member was forced to show his face. Well, kind of, because despite losing, the Mexican star didn't show his true form quite yet. No, after covering himself with a towel, he'd somehow be permitted to get another attempt when, just a month later on Nitro, he'd lose a hair versus mask match to Billy Kidman. And this time, with no towel to cover himself with anymore, it meant Psychosis was revealed to the world as Dionisio Torres, someone who quickly slid into irrelevance and eventually ended up driving that lawnmower down to the ring on mid-2000s SmackDown. That said, not all unmaskings have proven to be negative for the person involved. No, there's plenty of examples of taking a mask off being the best thing for someone's career at that time. And perhaps nowhere is there a better example of this being the case than the time Kane took his off in 2003 and completely reinvigorated his character in the process. But why was this even needed? After all, during the Attitude Era, there were few more feared figures than the Big Red Machine on account of his Michael Myers-esque ability to seem invulnerable while he was destroying everyone in his path. The only problem with this, though, was that come 2002, it was becoming clear that the gimmick was getting a little long in the tooth and that the aura of Glenn Jacobs was starting to wane as a result. So in order to combat this, it was decided that the best thing to do was to reawaken the monster inside him. And the way this monster would be reawakened on screen was through being forced to relive the trauma of his past. Yes, after losing to Triple H on the June 23rd episode of Raw that year, the Big Red Machine was forced to show his face to the world for the first time. But in doing so, he'd unintentionally revealed that the scars which had been left behind by the fire killing his parents all those years ago were actually psychological, not physical. That's right, Kane's face was completely undamaged, with this meaning that all the pain he was suffering from was internal. And with him now being reminded of this, he began waging a warpath on the Raw roster. So much so that he felt arguably even more fearsome during this period than he had done when he first debuted in 1997. And sure, as the years went on, The Undertaker's kayfabe sibling would don the mask once again, but this never felt as effective as it did the first time around, because once the genie had been let out of the bottle, it was very difficult to put it back in again. So maybe he should have taken some cues from our next subject then, as when he went from El Generico to a more familiar moniker in 2013, it took a certain French-Canadian star to all new levels of success. Now we're going to blow your minds here because we're going to suggest that El Generico is actually the same person as Sami Zayn. We know it's ridiculous, but it has been a long-standing rumor, so for the sake of argument, let's just say he was the man behind the mask. And if that is indeed the case, then the changeover would have happened when, following very successful runs in the likes of Pro Wrestling Guerrilla, Ring of Honor, Chikara, and Dragon Gate, Sami decided it was time to hang up his face covering once and for all, and instead make the jump over to WWE. Of course, well there, now with his face revealed to the world, it suddenly became apparent the Quebec native was a perfect fit for a babyface underdog on account of his endearing expressions. In fact, that's exactly what led to him becoming the heart and soul of NXT and one-time world champion in the developmental brand, with his story to reach the top there being second only to the Gargano-Ciampa feud, which came a few years later. And once he reached the main roster, he was able to use his winning facial expressions to eventually become the biggest babyface in the company altogether as Sami Uso, the honorary Uso of the Bloodline and modern-day People's Champion. Sure, you could argue that it's much more than just his face which got him to this point, as there is so much else Sami Zayn has going for him. But it certainly didn't hurt him, because for as great as El Generico was, it's highly unlikely a character like this would have ever made it beyond the undercard in WWE, if he'd ever even made it to WWE at all. But to be honest, we're still in two minds about including this entry, as the idea that Generico and Zayn are one and the same just seems so ludicrous. That said, one person who fans have no doubt was the man behind the mask was CM Punk, as in May of 2010, when he lost a match to Rey Mysterio and was forced to shave his hair as a result, he took to hiding this in any way he could. That's right, Cookie Monster Punk, a figure so divisive that even mentioning his name here is likely to create a whirlwind in the comments section, has always been one to capture the attention of fans, whether that be in a positive or negative way. So when he lost his trademark long, greasy hair at that year's Over the Limit pay-per-view, it suddenly put all eyes on him as everyone wanted to see what he'd look like without it. But with him playing the heel at this time, it meant he was always going to deny fans this for as long as possible, and that's exactly why, on the next episode of SmackDown, he'd show up wearing a mask which covered his whole head. Of course, the story then shifted to who was eventually going to be able to get this mask off of him and reveal his secret shame to the world that he no longer had his evil Mirror Universe Kurt Cobain locks. But no matter how much the given babyface of that week tried, whether it be Jack Swagger, Kane, or Rey Mysterio himself, no one was able to achieve this goal. That was until the Big Show came along and started a program with Punk, with this leading to the two squaring off on the July 16th episode of SmackDown where, finally, after months of waiting, Pepsi Phil's new haircut was revealed to the world. Was this satisfying for fans? Sure. But it also arguably worked out better for the Second City Saint in the long run too, as now with a new look, he was able to reinvent himself right in time for his rise to the main event scene the following year. And you all know what happened after that. Punk held the WWE title for 434 days, then went on to spectacularly quit the company in 2014 in frustration over how things were being run. Sure, he would eventually return to the ring, though that wouldn't happen until 2021 when he signed with All Elite Wrestling. That said, with his current status in Jacksonville being up in the air following the events of Brawl Out, we'll still have to wait and see if this relationship continues. One person who we've no doubt would be welcome in AEW again though, following his cameo appearance at the Elite Deletion that is, would be the Hurricane. But how has he managed to maintain his relevance after all this time? Well, that's because he knew exactly when to change things up for a while by removing his mask in 2005 and reverting back to the role of Gregory Helms. And what a smart decision this was in hindsight, as, while the Hurricane had always been popular with fans as a mid-card comedy act, like with anything funny, the joke was inevitably going to wear thin after a while. So after 5 years of playing WWE's resident superhero, Helms was aware enough to realize that if he wanted to keep himself relevant, he'd need to make some alterations. And that meant dropping the Hurricane gimmick and instead going back to who he had been in WCW, a top-tier cruiserweight that didn't need any pomp and circumstance to be a champion. Still, there would have to be an explanation for this sudden change of character in kayfabe, so that's why, on the October 17th episode of Raw that year, after being on the receiving end of a beatdown from Kurt Angle, the North Carolina native tore off his mask in frustration over the fact that his partner Rosie hadn't been there to help him. And the situation between the two would only get worse from there, because now refusing to wear his superhero gear and instead choosing to refer to himself only by his real name, Helms spent the next few weeks leaving Rosie to fight in tag team matches himself. Then, once he'd had enough of toying with the NYE family member, he'd formally turn heel as, following this, he'd jump over to SmackDown and set his sights on reminding everyone why he was one of the best cruiserweights in the world. Would this work? Yeah, quite well in fact, because over the next couple of years, Gregory Helms became Cruiserweight Champion and, for a while at least, the face of the division during his subsequent 385-day reign. And once that ran its course, he was able to return to the gimmick he was most well known for, as in September of 2008, he once more donned the mask and became the Hurricane all over again. But had he not taken this break from the character for a while, it's likely that fans would have been too sick of it for it to mean anything by then. So it's just as well he did, because it's something Helms has been able to continue using to this day. Of course, he's not the only one who was able to reinvigorate their career by taking their mask off, only to then return to it again later on down the line. And perhaps the best example of this happening elsewhere can be found in TNA, because in 2012, it was there that Abyss became Joseph Park. That's right, after 10 years of playing Impact's resident movie monster and equivalent to Kane, it was decided in the early 2010s that the Abyss character needed to have a new wrinkle added to it. And this new wrinkle would turn out to be one which allowed Joseph Park, the man behind the gimmick, to show his more humorous side. Basically, it all started in March of that year, when Park, minus his mask, began appearing on TV claiming to be the up until then unseen brother of the monster. And as he would put it, his reason for showing up at this time was because as a result of his brother's feud with Bully Ray, Abyss had disappeared and no one had seen any sign of him for weeks. So obviously concerned then, Joseph Park kept investigating as the months went on, right up until the point the former TNA World Champion returned in May. Of course, at this point, Abyss would advise his supposed sibling to back off as he was, in his own words, getting too close to the fire. Not that such a warning kept Park away for long, however. No, he'd continue to keep appearing as it happened. But after a while, the reasons behind his brother's desire to get rid of him became apparent as, come July, the line between the two characters began to blur. How did this happen? Well, after the newcomer got busted open, he'd catch sight of his own blood and seemingly transform into Abyss right before fans' eyes. Yes, in a case worthy of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, it was now apparent that Joseph Park and Abyss were one and the same, two separate personalities sharing the same body. Was this wacky, even by wrestling standards? Sure, but it was fun nonetheless, and it allowed Park to revitalize himself right when he needed it the most. On top of that, as far as a mystery surrounding a masked performer, it was pretty easy to follow for even the most casual of fans, especially when compared to something like the mess that was Sin Cara around the same time over in WWE. Now, for some context here, Sin Cara was originally portrayed by Luis El Verde, more commonly known as Místico back in Mexico. But when he was unable to adapt to the WWE in-house style, it was decided another lucha star, also confusingly named Místico, would be brought in instead. Now, this left two competing people with the same gimmick on the same roster at the same time then, so needing to get rid of one, Vince McMahon decided to have the two feud with each other throughout 2011, with all this eventually leading to a mask versus mask match on the October 16th episode of Raw. And it was during this bout that, despite being brought in as the replacement, Jose Rodriguez, the second Místico, would lose, something which meant he'd be forced to unmask and rebrand himself as Único going forward. Confused yet? Well, it only gets worse from there. Because once the original Sin Cara left WWE in 2014 and returned to Mexico, Rodriguez took up the role again as for a second time he put on the Sin Cara mask. And with him now back under this, he'd soon find a new tag partner in Kalisto, as the pair became known as the Lucha Dragons. Of course, the main problem with this was that the whole lore of the gimmick had gotten so needlessly convoluted by then, few people cared about it anymore. And that meant, even if he was back with his old character, Jose Rodriguez failed to make much of an impact as anything more than an undercard tag team act. So when he left WWE in 2019 and returned to Mexico himself, it was probably for the best for all parties, as following that, he'd play a new masked character named Cinta de Oro, one based on a friend and fellow performer who died a couple of years prior. And this has led to him using more and more extravagant face coverings each time he performs then, something which lucha wrestlers have often taken great pride in trying to top each other with. That said, when it comes to our next entry today, they weren't about flash when it came to their masks. No, in the case of Doom, they always cared more about beating people up than how they looked while they were doing it. But when your team is made up of Ron Simmons and Butch Reed, none of that should come as a surprise. After all, both men have a reputation as legit tough guys for a reason. So feared were they, in fact, that during those early days together in 1989 WCW, they pretty much had to disguise their identities, as it was the only way anyone would be willing to step into the ring with them. Of course, as soon as their unwitting opponents started feeling their wrath, they quickly understood the error of their way, because whether they were underneath masks or not, the heels were just as destructive of a force. Really then, you could argue that there's never been a more accurate name for a team, as wherever they went, Doom was certainly on the cards for whoever was standing on the other side of the ring from them. But as they got more and more over, it became apparent a trick was being missed in having the pair show their faces, and that was because the only thing scarier than seeing two big mystery masked men coming towards you was seeing Simmons and Reed coming towards you instead. So after losing to the Steiner brothers in February of 1990, as per a pre-match stipulation, Doom removed their disguises and revealed themselves to the world for the first time. Then, following this, now liberated, they created a path of destruction which eventually saw them become not only the NWA World Tag Team Champions, but inaugural WCW World Tag Team Champions too. Yes, in the end, sometimes unmasking can be the best thing for your career. Sure, it doesn't go well for everyone, but at the very least, it can create a moment memorable enough that people talk about it for years to come.